if you're interested in consciousness, if you're interested in philosophy of mind, why not explore that whole amazing cosmos of different forms of experience which you can't really explain. If certain psychedelic induced mystical experiences are ineffable, if you can't put them into words and you can't report them, then you can't get a neural correlate to them either. Let's say that you did further tests to determine whether certain psychedelics decrease brain activity whilst the report was of intense, rich experience, ordered experience. That would be a fascinating finding, wouldn't it? That would actually be a way of empirically getting into metaphysics. And it's psychedelics that would allow for such tests because it temporarily changes the functioning of normal prosaic brain functioning. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things yet to discover.
Peter, if you had to give me a philosophical history of the mind-body problem, what would you tell me? What story would you craft, and which historical figures come to mind when you think of the story?
Well, I suppose the traditional story that Schopenhauer tells is from Descartes. I mean, Descartes seems to think that, with him, the whole problem about essentially upward causation, downward causation begins and their interaction. But of course, in the West, we see notions of the mind, of course, in the classic philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, of course, with regard to, the soul, the forms, teleology, whatnot. What story would I tell? I still like to tell the Cartesian story, to be honest, because I think that because I take quite radical views of the mind. I would maybe less radical these days, but I like to always go into the sort of modern history as to why people think that's radical, why they think it's strange and whatever. So I like to take that Cartesian route of the classic Cartesian dualism. But then I also like the history of idealism, which is kind of lost, I think, to a certain extent, especially British idealism or absolute idealism. I was just reading a text on it the other day, and it said that for many reasons, but partly because of the Great War, there was a big antagonism against Germany and against nationalism, and as a result, that kind of German-based idealism, which became heavily prominent in Britain, was kind of left alone. So you get this history of philosophy from Mill to Russell, and you skip like 50 years in the late sort of 19th, early 20th century. So I always like to go through that. British idealism basically came out of Hegel mostly, starting with Green, ending with F.H. Bradley. And then, from F.H. Bradley's Appearance and Reality, 1893, as a kind of advance of that, you get Whitehead's philosophy, Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy. I mean, he called his main book Process and Reality because it came out of, based on Bradley's Appearance and Reality. It was seen as a sort of realist advance on that idealism, although Bradley himself didn't know whether he was a realist or idealist. But anyway, so to understand Whitehead, it's good to look at, to understand Bradley, really. And to understand Bradley, you go through the British idealists, absolute idealists, and then you realize, well, you really got to know Hegel a bit. And then to understand Hegel, Kant, Leibniz, Wolff, and so on, then you go back to where it all began, essentially with the ancient Greeks. So, but my own particular interests, I would say, at the moment at least, lie around that kind of lost history of absolute idealism, which is kind of predominant philosophy in the English-speaking world for 50 years.
I'm glad you brought up idealism, because when I read your work and when I explore it, a big part of me thought about why you're not an idealist instead of a panpsychist. So do you want to touch on that?
Sure. Funnily enough, I'm currently writing a review of Bernardo Kastrup's Analytic Idealism, his latest book, so we can go into that if you want later. But why? First of all, I would say that panpsychism and idealism are not mutually exclusive. So you get, for example, in Leibniz both, I would say, and perhaps in Whitehead, it depends how you define idealism. And I should say that I did count myself amongst the idealists years ago. So first of all, getting introduced to Kant, Immanuel Kant, first critique at university, it sort of blew my mind. And And you know, because of something quite rational, quite reasonable, still influential today, of course. Even in modern theories of predictive processing, whatever, you can sort of trace that back to Kant to a certain extent. But then Schopenhauer took hold of me because he's sort of an advance upon Kant in a way that will was actually something that was it was the thing in itself that you could know within yourself at least. That seemed an advance, and Nietzsche coming out, Schopenhauer, kind of changed my ethical views quite radically. Yeah, but then I also studied Bergson at Warwick University with Keith Ansel Pearson. I did Hegel with Stephen Holgate, so I got into all of that. I had a good mix, really. And but after university, you know, I especially went into Alfred North Whitehead's thought, as I said, because it seems like the kind of culmination of a lot of this idealism. I mean, I could go into it. I mean, the great thing about Whitehead is, you know, that Kant's whole so-called Copernican revolution was partly due to Hume on causation, saying we can never directly perceive causation. Whitehead argued that actually you can directly perceive causation, and that's the same thing as perception, apprehension for him. And same thing as memory, and he brought it all together in this very parsimonious way. But as a result, it made Kant's critical philosophy superfluous, you know, because it was sort of reaction to something that Hume got wrong. Anyway, you know, one keeps reading, and I'm sure my views will change as time goes on. But,
well, I guess I might have jumped the gun a bit. Let's start off by defining consciousness. Before we continue into your actual views and how it differs from your typical panpsychist view or idealist view, how would you define consciousness?
Well, I always approach this question in a tripartite fashion. So you can see I've been asked this before. I teach philosophy of mind, you know.
Yeah.
So my general answer is the approach to take, which I find the most useful, is to divide it into three parts. The first part is to ask what the contents of consciousness are. So that would include, you know, colors, sound, sense, emotions, feelings, will, time rates, time flows, stuff like that. Qualia, well, that's a controversial word, but I think as a generic term, it's fine. So that's the first thing, you know, sort of one can talk about these different types of consciousness, absolutely. Second part of the answer is to talk about the differentiators of consciousness from non-consciousness, generally matter, but that's what is matter is just as difficult, right? So that would be things like, well, these are all, like, you know, like more purported differentiators. So like privacy, for example, or non-spatiality with Descartes, or non-inferentiality, or you know, and so on and so forth. All these sort of you know, like purported things that make mind, teleology, you know, things that make mind different from matter, but all of those are questionable, right? So in answering the question, what's consciousness, you have to put forward all these questionable theories, right? Some of them probably right, some probably wrong. And then the third part of the answer to the question, what is consciousness, is the relations of consciousness to non-consciousness. So then you get into the isms, you know, so then, you know, dualism, different types of physicalism, emergentism, epiphenomenalism, idealism, absolute monism, you know, the transcendent even, and so on and so forth. All of which are, as you know, in fact, the purpose of this podcast, highly debatable. So, you know, yeah, so I think basically to answer the question, what's consciousness, you just have to go through a whole array of questionable theories to even begin. So I don't think there's any sort of absolute answer to that.
I was speaking to Stuart Hameroff about this I think it was a week ago, and he was talking about how in 1994, when David Chalmers mentioned the heart problem, that their intention was to spend the entire weekend. The first day was to define consciousness, but they spent the entire weekend then stuck on the definition. So it seems like this is really a problematic aspect of trying to discuss consciousness. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, you know, I think philosophy of mind really is concerned with that question and the third part of the answer, you know, the different sort of relationships. Although, of course, it's been focused really on physicalism and dualism in the 20th century. I think that's changing a bit now. But yeah, no, it's no easy option. And if you're an idealist, of course, or a certain type of idealist, Hegelian maybe, then consciousness is the same thing as reality anyway. So, and to us, what is reality? It's, deepest, most fundamental of all questions. So I
You've
don't
got,
know the answer to these
you've got a nice
questions.
grasp of the history of philosophy of mind. I notice when you talk about it, when you write about it, you really have studied this very well, and you articulate your answers very well as well, and it's enjoyable to listen to it. What do you think is the reason for this current shift from most materialist, physicalist theories of consciousness slowly transitioning into this panpsychist or idealist framework? Why do you think this is happening?
I mean, I think multifaceted reasonings. As always, there's an infinity of
There is no
everything.
yes or no questions here. It's just
Yeah, well, yes. Well, I think on the surface level, David Chalmers then, talking about renaming an old problem, mind body problem, hard problem consciousness, just brought to light the fact that nothing was really satisfactory. None of the sort of general answers are satisfactory of the 20th century, at least. So because of that, sort of cul-de-sac with the hard problem, people went back to the drawing board, as it were, and looked to the past for possible ways of approaching this question. And that's, I think, why, for example, panpsychism came back onto the book table, because this has got a great pedigree. R.G. Collingwood, he wrote In the Idea of Nature. He writes that the ancient Greeks thought that the whole of nature was alive. That was their metaphor for reality, an organism. And then we sort of moved into the metaphor of the machine. And then he said, we're now moving into the metaphor of history with evolution and so on. But I think that, so there's a great pedigree in panpsychism with the Greeks, with Renaissance thinkers. I mean, it was Patrizzi, the Renaissance thinker, who coined panpsychism. Interestingly, if you read that, though, it means what we today probably define more as pantheism. So the meaning's changed. And as a kind of semi-Whiteheadian, we prefer the word pan-experientialism, but I just see that as a type of panpsychism, really. So that's and then there's great thinkers who are panpsychists, like I mentioned a few already: Leibniz, Spinoza, Russell, arguably, Whitehead then, and many others in the contemporary world, Galen Strawson, and so on.
How would, oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
go on.
No?
No. So that's one reason. I mean, we've come to cul-de-sac. There's great pedigree of panpsychist thinkers. So people are approaching panpsychism again. That's on the sort of logical surface level. I think there are not deeper, but other socio-economic, political factors as well. So, relating to the church and the sort of battle between the sort of the middle classes, the bourgeois, and the clergy, and so on, and sort of this and that. And I mean, multifaceted, and it's pretty impossible to prove anything, So
yeah, it's so multifactorial. It's very hard to pin down certain reasons. Because I do believe if Nixon hadn't, with Timothy Leary, if all of that hadn't happened, I believe that panpsychists or idealists I think it would be more of a thriving philosophy at this point.
Well, it's
And again,
interesting.
multifactorial. So I do know that it's not a single entity.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think if the war didn't happen, things would be extremely different for sure. Timothy Leary and the whole sort of psychedelic 60s outburst. I mean, like the great pity about that was that there were intellectuals looking at psychedelic consciousness, like Humphrey Osmond, who coined psychedelic and hallucinogen, and Aldous Huxley, and they had organized this great gathering in the 50s, in the 1950s, called Outsight, where they invited Einstein and Jung and AJR, and so on. Was it AJR? Anyway, some great thinkers together to take mescaline and then write about it. Those 1950s, they almost got it all together, all the fund, promised funding from the Ford Foundation, but in the end, Ford Foundation pulled the plug and didn't go ahead. Some 10 years later, then Timothy Leary messes it all up. I think psychedelic research would have steamed ahead had it not been for that. I don't just blame Leary, of course. I mean, it was the political situation that also suppressed it. I mean, again, interesting histories there, but
There's
I
so
mean, it goes back, I should say, just quickly, it also relates to the, colonization of the Americas when the sort of Iberians prohibited psychedelic drugs, when they came across them in South America, Middle America,
mm.
and also related to the American temperance movement against alcohol. So that interrelates to the church, especially. It's quite fascinating.
Before we get into the philosophy of psychedelics, I think to touch on the consciousness aspect here, you mentioned you're going to write a piece on Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism. What is this going to be about? And if you could, how would you really define your view of consciousness, or do you consider yourself a panpsychist? Because I know you wrote your PhD on panpsychism, but what is your actual view, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, good question. I think it's a fusion. I mean, first of all, I always say that I don't believe really anything. I entertain ideas, right? So I'm not absolutely dogmatic about my view because I know problems. When you really get into something, you know the problems better than anyone else, right? So it's hard. I'm not. But at the moment, my preference is for a fusion really between Spinoza and Whitehead. And so it's a kind of it is a panpsychism. So I do believe that consciousness or sentience or mentality runs throughout the whole of nature. Absolutely. Um, I believe I'm a monist. I think that mind and matter are essentially the same thing. So this is a Spinozism, like
Mm.
the mind and matter being different attributes or expressions of the same substance. But unlike Spinoza and with Whitehead, um, I'm a process philosopher as well. So I believe that that so for Spinoza, the laws of nature were constant because essentially nature was God and it had to be perfect, right? So and that didn't allow for freedom, mental causation, effective mental causation. Whereas with Whitehead, you've got this creative universe, this creative impulse, and so I sort of I always say, Spinoza plus Darwin equals Whitehead. So that's the kind of, so I'm going, so I would classify myself as a Whiteheadian, but with certain caveats. Some of the details in Whitehead I don't think are necessary, for example. But like one thing that I especially think is important in Whitehead, you can also get it in Bergson and Bradley to a certain extent, is this amazing concept of prehension, which is means that it's in a way the opposite of representation. It's a form of perception, but it's not representation. It's the kind of absorption of the outside, the object into the inside, as it were, into the subject. So part of the object becomes part of the subject. So the relationship between appearance and reality is really the relationship between part and whole. That's a very, so that's sort of symbiosis of Bergson and Whitehead. They admired each other's work. I think that's extremely important. So it's a type of realism as against idealism, that you actually do perceive the outside world. Now, of course, you color it to a certain extent due to evolution or whatever, but there's a certain influx of reality into our perception. In fact, part of the outside becomes part of the inside. And that's the kind of, I think that concept is especially important, something I like to pursue. So it's a kind of, that's part known as process relational philosophy, really. And it's related to the, 4E cognition and whatever extended mind, but it's kind of in a more original form of it, more extreme form, really.
So, what would you address in Bernardo Kastrup's idealism in this piece? What would be the most important aspects of it? Where would you differentiate yourself from his work, and which parts of his work do you admire, if any? Because I'm not
Well,
sure if this is going to be a critique or a. We'll see.
I've got a funny relationship with Bernardo Kastrup because over the years I've criticized him a bit on Schopenhauer, understanding Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and so on. But we did have a conversation recorded actually about a month ago, and I think we were really affable, polite, and whatever. And I did enjoy his book. I do like the way that he sort of ruffles up feathers, especially in the psychedelic world. He presents an alternative, at least makes people think, even if you don't agree with it fully. So anyway, reading his latest book, Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell, is a summary book, really. A small book. Yeah, had some good points. It's pretty much Kantianism. So but not quite actually. It's a mixture between Kant and Hegel but neither of them. So it's the view that we represent the world in a particular way, and but the way we represent the world is very different from how the world actually is. So there's a strong difference between appearance and reality. So like phenomena and noumena, that's the Kantian aspect of it. And he uses the metaphor of a dashboard, So, we see the dial in an airplane. We see, let's say the outside temperature on a dial. Of course, that represents the actual world. That is not the actual world. The dial is not the actual world itself. Eddington made the same metaphor, interestingly, 100 years ago. But so the outside world is kind of unknowable to in itself, but then he makes this argument, which is a bit loose as part of my review, that it actually commits a fallacy of the undistributed middle, I think, fundamentally. But it's the view that, the outside, we don't know what the outside world is, but we know it's non-physical. And what do I know? What do I know? What do I know is non-physical? And then he says the mental. So then he makes this move that therefore the outside world is mental. I sort of simplify it, but that's his idealism. So it's that in that sense is like Hegel, So the whole of reality is mental, and we're part of that. But it differs. So that's how it's Hegelian sense, but it differs from Hegel in the sense that for Hegel, this outside reality is the sort of logical unfurling of Geist, it's a very rational mind, as it were, right? It's essentially God, the absolute. But for Kastrup, this outside mentality, and he uses Huxley's term mind at large, interestingly, but he doesn't, not in the same way that Huxley does, really, following Bergson. So for Kastrup, the outside world is a mind, but it's a very primitive mind because it hasn't gone through the sort of adaptability that evolution forces upon organisms. So it's kind of like a goldfish mind. It's kind of toddler God, as it were. So not quite pantheism. So my main difference is that I believe the dashboard, the appearance and reality, as I've intimated, is porous. So imagine a dashboard where it's got some sort of colored glass portholes, maybe, and some air vents coming in, right? So yes, we do see the world through a glass darkly, but it's not a complete difference. There are degrees of difference between appearance and reality, and that's the realism. And the interesting thing, right, is historically, this is the history. This is the history of idealism that was lost in the West. One of the reasons that idealism was put down is because of the war and the church and the bourgeois and the industry and scientism and whatnot. But another reason is logical. It actually developed into realism. Like I said, Bradley's appearance and reality was a pivotal moment, and that's what I prefer. This kind of, because I think otherwise you're really alienated from nature. You're sort of almost in the solipsist world. But with this prehension, with this sort of absorption of the outside to the in, then you avoid that, and you don't need to assume solipsism. And it just makes more sense to me, realism over representationalism.
So, because Bernardo loves working with Don Hoffman, and they often talk about each other's work. And when he does the math and physics, they seem to come to the conclusion that we don't see reality as what it is at all. So there's no sort of porous dashboard. It's actually just non-existent, and we've made up certain ways to do this. Do you think that sort of naive realism, taking to its absolute extreme, is, what if it's true though? What if it is something? What if we really are not seeing this for what it is? I mean, I get what you're talking about. You want this to be some sort of a real feeling, but what if it's not? How would we go about trying to disprove that? I'm not an idealist, just by the way. Well, I'll prove it. So I'm not, just like you. I have no, at this point with this podcast, I have no idea where I stand. It's getting harder and harder every day. So, but I've become more and more fascinated by each theory at this point, and I find proving and disproving many of them is becoming more and more difficult.
Yeah. Well, with naive realism, so like you see reality as it actually is. I'm not advocating that, and that's not the realism really that came maybe with Moore, but it's not really the realism. I prefer the organic realism, as it's so called, Whitehead and so on. But I think with naive realism, it's somewhat easy to disprove because you just consider the fact that different perspectives of the same object will change the color of it, and might, without different light sources, there's different colors. So it's hard to say that. Sort of, for example, the color exists out there to a certain extent, and of course we can understand that different species will have evolved different sense modalities, and to the extent that we can't even know what they are really. That was part of Nagel's famous "What's It Like to Be a Bat" essay. And the fact that even within your own self, you see things differently at different times, especially if you're taking drugs, right? So it's hard to say, well, there are normal conditions. This was actually attempted by a few people. There are normal conditions, unnormal conditions, then this is the reality. But I don't think there's such a thing as normal conditions too loose, right? So, and also, what Bergson calls a rhythm of duration or time rate, the speed at which you see things move. There's no objective form of that. There can't be an objective form of that. So you understand there must be, I'm sort of arguing against myself now to some extent, but there must be, I always take a hybrid view that there must be certain elements that we project into reality. It's very interesting as well when you look at space and different dimensions of space, like W.K. Clifford, who was a Cambridge apostle, he spoke about a worm, a two-dimensional worm, and how it would perceive reality. It would perceive bends as force, for example, right? And you can understand when you read this, that's right. So we experience sort of three-dimensional space, as it were, and forces. But in theory, if you increase the dimensionality of your perception, you might perceive a force as another dimension, right? So there's you can sort of conceptually understand how the way we perceive the world is not a necessity at all. It doesn't have to be that way. So that's my idealist angle. And also my idealist angle is that consciousness is ubiquitous throughout the cosmos. But at the same time, it's like Bradley makes this point that it is an assumption to think that the feelings, let's say, you have are confined within yourself. Because if you think about pure experience, you don't make that distinction between me and the outside world, right? That's a later inference. So to think that we only know our own minds is a really later derivative position, as intellectual position. It's not a pure phenomenological position. So Bradley then argues that we can share emotions. So when you, let's say, come into a room and you suddenly sort of lighten up, let's say it's a party or whatever, and you think, well, why did I lighten up? Okay, because people are smiling and laughing and saying, hey, Peter, welcome. And then you think, yeah, that's good, I'm appreciated, or this is going to be a fun night or whatever. Or our emotions somehow and this comes back to panpsychism now, our emotions, as Whitehead believed it, part of what we call matter or physicality, like forces. So not something extraneous to forces, but part of forces. So we see like electromagnetism. We think of electromagnetism as a particular way, but for Whitehead, this is an abstraction. In other words, only part of the truth. The full truth would be that there's an emotion within light, for example. It explains aesthetic appreciation to a certain extent. And so likewise, like we, seeing others is not just a perceptual kind of television representation. It's rather an absorption of who they are and so on to a certain extent, but it's on this primitive level that is subconscious. So for Whitehead at least, so we're not sort of consciously aware of it, but nonetheless it influences us, as does sunlight and so on, like sunbathing, whatnot.
Yeah, well, speaking of light, and most people are going to see the frequencies of our shirts as very much the same, but we just want to clarify that they're not. They're probably slightly different. It's a bit of a naive.
Slightly different, but not
similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And numerically distinct. Yeah.
Yes. Definitely different frequencies here and there. Tell me, Peter, if you had Huxley, James, Whitehead, Nietzsche, Spinoza, and Schopenhauer all hanging on a cliff, One of them's about to, well, all of them are falling, but you can only save one. Who would you save and why?
That's harsh. That's harsh.
That's an intense question.
Yeah,
It's probably the darkest question I've asked on this show.
yeah. That is dark. Yeah. Um, well, not Schopenhauer because he probably, like would want to go. Um, uh, I, oh God,
I guess Nietzsche might also want to go.
possibly. No, I think Nietzsche was an optimist. Ultimately, I think it's got a
Yeah.
bad rep. But I think I'd bring back Whitehead probably because I've got a few questions for him.
What would those questions be?
What he meant by, certain. I mean, it gets so complex sometimes in some of his works that there's multiple interpretations of it. Actually, no, I wouldn't. I'll tell you what, I'd bring back Spinoza because it's a deep question about whether the attributes, there's a famous thing in Spinoza's studies about whether the attributes are subjective or objective. So I'd ask him about that probably. Yeah.
The, when you started in this field, did you have any preconceived ideas when you first entered the philosophy arena? Let's say, for example, coming in as a materialist, were you ever an emergentist, and then slowly transition into this panpsychist view? What has been your view
Yeah.
over time, and how's it?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's related to obviously you can't avoid inculcation, right? You can't avoid being brainwashed by your culture to a certain extent, or to a full extent, maybe. So I came in I'm half Swedish, half British, but I've lived most of my life in Britain, in Cornwall. Came in as a kind of strict materialist, really, but I had never really studied it, so I didn't know whether I was like an identity theorist or an emergentist or an epiphenomenalist or whatever, limitivist. But obviously, there was just matter, and mind came out of brains. A certain activity in the brain, which we are yet to discover. That was my general view, and but then when I started to actually study, that was my default view, right?
Mm.
And it's kind of what I was taught. It was kind of subconsciously taught in schools. Um, it was never explicitly told. This is the
Yes.
reality. It's just kind of these unwritten assumptions that really influence people because they're unquestioned and you don't bring it to consciousness. But when I looked into it, I saw that there were different types of materialism. So then which one do you believe, right? And then when you look into the history, you realize why I actually believed that. And then um, I look for alternatives. I think as well that studying Bergson and Kant, especially, opened my mind up because in Britain, you're not taught philosophy at all.
Oh,
So yeah, not at school. So when I started reading it in university, it was just an eye opener because I'd always considered anything non-materialistic to be like religious New Age
yeah.
nonsense
I think
when I was
that's exactly the same thing that happened to me.
right.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but now I think materialism is an ideology as well,
Mm.
and it's in the same ballpark as a lot of the other theories. So yeah, no, I think well, one thing that influenced me actually with regard to my panpsychist sort of veering was Nietzsche because he spoke about the will to power, will as a Macht, coming from Schopenhauer to a certain extent. And he said this is a pathos. The will to power is a pathos, right? It's a feeling. And this is fundamental. I mean, this is more in his notebooks than his published work, but there's some in his published work, Beyond Good and Evil, section 36, I seem to remember. That there's this kind of fundamental drive. It's subconscious as a drive to development, and that kind of got me thinking. And then I read Schopenhauer. It was much more sort of philosophically developed, but his is more of a will to survive, really. Spinoza, you get the Conatus, somewhat similar as well. So that got me thinking, there's this kind of underlying drive, and we represent it as matter and force and whatever, but it's not the essential aspect of reality. And that inner aspect of reality you can feel within yourself, your drives, and your emotions are sort of secondary to those. And reading Bergson, Keith Ansel Pearson, like I said, I was never really that fond of Bergson's special kind of dualism, but it was interesting. There's things you can take out of Bergson still. And yeah, and then I properly read Whitehead, and that seemed to quell a lot of my issues.
Mm.
Anyway, you're reading all this, and then you go back to the people we spoke with a few years ago, and they're just still stuck in that. Yeah, what you're talking about, obviously, like, and then you think, no, it's not that simple. There are problems, and yeah, and I'm still not saying that I know what the truth is. As I say, I've just got preferences,
Yeah.
um, but I hope to develop them as time goes by.
Yeah.
But of course, when you develop, you discover more problems as well, right? So
Exactly. Yeah. The more you know, the more you question.
yeah.
Uh, the answer becomes less obvious. But I mean, to quote you quoting someone else, let's take a trip at this point. Psychedelics, the philosophy of psychedelics. Firstly, how does one come and get into this field and make a career out of it? And secondly, what is the philosophy of psychedelics?
Um,
But
well, it's
perhaps maybe start with the second question, then go to the first.
what is the philosophy of psychedelics? Well, here's our book on it, Philosophy and Psychedelics. So you can get a start there, the introduction especially. Um, the philosophy of psychedelics is, I would say, a relatively new phenomenon, even though, as I say, William James, as you mentioned, was sort of speaking about it in 1902, and actually before that, in 1892, I think he wrote on some Hegelisms, and the footnote is all about how he understood Hegel after taking nitrous oxide, right? So it kind of starts with James, to a certain extent, the founder of modern psychology as well. And it's a it's a way of, I mean, it's very, it encompasses a lot. So you've got the phenomenology, you can apply phenomenology, classic Husserlian phenomenology to it, and so on. It's completely new data for phenomenology. And in fact, something has developed in the philosophy of psychedelics called microphenomenology to really sort of pin down what is going on. From my own preference is to apply knowledge of metaphysics to psychedelic experience. So, for example, in that book, I've written an essay on framing the experience of 5-MeO-DMT, which is a very powerful psychedelic in Spinozist terms, in relation to the so-called intellectual love of God or nature. I've also written about, I've just written about Bergson's influence on Huxley and the Doors of Perception. It's interesting how you can frame in different ways psychedelic experience according to old metaphysics. In fact, the book I'm writing now for Bloomsbury, another one, is called the Psychedelics Metaphysics Manual, and it's about offering to people without a philosophical background um, different metaphysical options in which they might interpret their psychedelic experience and make it significant. It's based on an essay of mine on the need for metaphysics in psychedelic therapy and research. So that's my preference, but there's a lot of stuff, like a lot of stuff on epistemology. Obviously, how do we know? How do we know that what we experience is veridical or delusory? There's a lot of ethical issues, like, for example, the comforting delusion objection, which Michael Pollan and others have spoken of. So, like, is it not unethical to make people better by fostering a delusion upon them via psychedelics? So there's a lot of different answers to that question. Chris Leatherby's written a good book addressing that in part. Um, and then so I mean the three columns of philosophy, traditionally metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, are all part of the philosophy of psychedelics. And interestingly, as this whole psychedelic renaissance unfolds, more and more ethical questions come into view, with relation to, like, the law and appropriation of indigenous use, and safety issues, and all sorts of things, and really, although I'm in the philosophy of psychedelics in Exeter University. I'm really in the more broader scope of psychedelic research generally, because it is by its nature interdisciplinary. So you need the neuroscientists there, of course, Leo Roseman from Imperial. You need the anthropologists going out, and talking about how psychedelic use differs from current use. You need historians. I mean, if we look at, like, for example, psychedelic therapy in the 50s, it was the psychiatrist who was taking the psychedelic rather than the patient. Now it's turned around, right? um, criminologists, sociologists with relation to the law, psychologists, obviously, psychiatrists, pharmacologists. You need all of those specialisms to get a full, concrete, satisfactory view of what's going on. And of course, the reason for it all is that, contrary to the sort of propaganda of the last few decades, it's now realized that psychedelics can be quite therapeutic rather than harmful to people. So, and that's why a lot of money is being put into it. In Exeter University, we've studied the first masters in psychedelics online, PG Cert. We got a master's in person starting in late 2025. And yeah, so lots going on. And it's not just Exeter, of course, UCL, Imperial, Harvard just got a huge grant for psychedelic research, $16 million, I think, last year. Jeez. So it's a mushrooming field.
I like that. When I think about it, and as a doctor, when I used to work as a psychiatry medical officer in the public sector, in the state facilities here in South Africa, and you see the effect that certain psychedelics have had on patients and causing psychosis, delusions, etc. But then you go to the private sector and you see a completely different type of patient. You see the people who have been using it for therapy, for solving trauma, etc. And you see such an abrupt difference. You can tell that the type of usage, the way it's used, the way it's controlled or even uncontrolled can provide positive or negative effects. I tried my best to not make this a medical podcast. So I've always got a disclaimer. This is not medical advice ever. This is a philosophy podcast. But what have you seen since the new rise in psychedelic use in research? Both anecdotally and empirically, evidence-wise, what has been the shift that's occurring currently?
If we say the psychedelic renaissance started about 12 years ago or so, the first sort of phase of that was to really forcefully try to move people's perceptions away from the negative aspects of psychedelics, that they make you jump out windows or they lead to psychosis or neurosis or that they're addictive, so on, and the hippie kind of connotations, all of that. So you had in psychedelic conferences a lot of, white shirted doctors coming in and talking about brain regions. So, that was the first phase. And then a lot more research. I mean, when I started, I should say, when I started, people said to me, "Don't get into this because it would be a career killer." Don't mess with your brain, your mind. Number one. Secondly, don't write about this because it's not seen as serious. But it's just too interesting intrinsically. When you've had a psychedelic experience, it's just so radically different. It's just so rich. It can be in a way that you just have to look into it again. So I just pursued it, but I didn't, as you said, my PhD thesis was not on psychedelics; it was on panpsychism, and that's radical enough. But
I was just about to say you chose both the fields. I mean, it's consciousness and psychedelics. You went all in.
Yeah, I know. I living on the edge. Yeah, almost falling off. Who knows? I might do one day.
Yeah.
But yeah, no. Can't return to your question. So there was that phase. Another interesting thing really was that, in the early 20th century, there was some trials on DMT, especially just looking at neural correlates of DMT, and it wasn't for therapeutic purposes. And in the 60s, as well, there was therapy involved, and there's psycholytic therapy in Europe and psychedelic therapy in America, which differed. So European one was very Freudian based, psychoanalytic based. But the general feeling about psychedelics was that they were political tools, you get it in Marcuse, his essay on liberation in 1960 was it that psychedelics are a way of seeing the world differently, seeing how we're being encaged within certain political systems and so on. But in the 21st century, they're seen as therapeutic tools. People are being very careful now, doing very careful analyses, because everyone is scared that this potential form of medicine or therapy won't get approved, and that would be quite disastrous for a lot of people. So it's a very step-by-step, small, cautious, unlike like a few decades ago. But the interesting thing is, when you look at before the 60s, when you look at like Osmond, like I mentioned, Humphrey Osmond, who's a British psychiatrist, we worked with Huxley, and the philosopher John Smithies, very interesting philosopher, a neurophilosopher. It was intellectual, and like Osmond himself, as a psychiatrist, said, the important thing about psychedelics in his essay of the 1957, where he coins it, is its religious, sociological, and philosophical implications. That has been lost, and that was forgotten about, really, which is a great pity. And so with the philosophy of psychedelics, we're returning to that to a certain extent, I think. So it's still it's growing, and it's got loose form. You can't really strictly define it like consciousness,
Yeah.
But it's really fascinating. I mean, especially if you're if you're interested in consciousness, if you're interested in philosophy of mind, why not explore that whole amazing cosmos of different forms of experience? I mean, forms of experience which don't even have, you can't really explain. I mean, I've experienced things on psilocybin which are, you could just about call them experiences, but they can't be categorized as, let's say, a sensation or a conception or a feeling, but nonetheless very powerful type of experience, So it's just trying to sort of get a grip on what's going on there, and also it just makes you realize the power of the mind, that the mind can create these most amazing visual, I don't know, like spaceships and cosmic journeys and aliens and all these things, but also just kind of what would probably be defined as mystical states, which are not visual at all in many cases, but just these intense states of existence.
I remember when I made the intro for this podcast at some point, I remember saying any atypical state of mind is an absolutely valuable asset to the study of mind. And I mean, these states of mind are very, very fascinating. Anyone who studies the mind who neglects this portion of the field, it's such a massive component. This is something that if you do not study, you're making the most ignorant decision you can make when you concluding anything about the mind.
I think it's like if you studied music, but you only listen to 21st century music, it would be like that, What you don't want to listen to all everything that's before, all the whole other world of music.
You
mentioned you have to fight against prejudice, with regard to psychedelics. A lot of people still don't take it seriously. Hard to get kind of state-approved funding for it. Although to balance that, you do get a lot of philanthropists who are interested, rich philanthropists, who are interested in it instead. But no, I'm happy in this world, and also it's kind of like there's a nice community. I'm also director of Breaking Convention, which is Europe's largest psychedelic conference. We've got 1,800 people coming to Exeter in April now, and it's just a lovely kind of communal feel to it. Having said that, though, it has become a little bit self-conscious in the last few years, a little bit self-critical as to where it's going, and some bad apples and stuff like that. So. Generally, it's a nice place to be.
But I would say in any field, there's always a bunch of bad apples.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing.
It's not like it's something you can escape in any way.
No.
There was a term you used once. I can't remember where I saw this or read it, but you were describing these experiences that are not what we call qualia sight. You named it something when you have this. It's almost this ethereal experience that's not describable. Do you remember what that was?
Well, maybe you mean the term ineffable, which is from William James. Actually, Humphrey Davy mentions it before. Yeah, you can't put it into words. I use the word psi-X for psychedelic experience.
I think that was it.
Yeah.
I think that was it.
Yeah. But there's an interesting thing about if certain psychedelic-induced mystical experiences are ineffable, if you can't put them into words and you can't report them, then you can't get a neural correlate to them either. Right. And I think that that is a kind of I mean, that's another thing that psychedelic research does. It brings up these interesting theoretical questions as to, well, how, what are really the limits of neuroscience and understanding the mind if there are things that you can't report, just like animal minds, right? You can't really fully correlate things because you don't get one side of the correlate, you don't get the report, right? Same with psychedelic drugs for human beings. arguably, some people say no, it is. I mean, William James said they're ineffable and then writes 200 pages about it later, right? So it's all debatable. Interestingly, Kastrup wasn't a massive spat. His take is that psychedelics were shown to decrease brain activity, all brain activity, right? Which kind of falsified for him physicalism or emergentism, that with greater relevant brain activity you'd get greater phenomenology, and thus opens the door for idealism. But that, I think, is an open question. I don't like. So I spoke to someone on that study who said no, it didn't show that at all, and so it's an open question. But it's very fascinating. Like, this is a very interesting question. Let's say that you did further tests to determine whether certain psychedelics decrease brain activity, whilst the report was of intense, rich experience, ordered experience. That would be a fascinating finding, wouldn't it? If it was verified and checked and tested many times. That would tell us, that would actually be like a way of empirically getting into metaphysics to a certain extent, right?
Mm.
And it's psychedelics that would allow for such tests, because it sort of temporarily changes functioning of normal prosaic brain functioning. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things yet to discover, I think.
And yet there are some scientific theories that possibly could explain this. If you get someone like John Joe McFadden's semi-field theory, perhaps, because merely looking at these neural correlates might not be the answer. Someone like Stuart Hameroff might be right, Penrose might be right, because maybe when you do look at this from a maybe quantum perspective, something might be going on. They describe it as Occam's razor. If you can solve this with quantum mechanics, it solves multiple things in one go. Because people often say, okay, we don't know consciousness, we don't know quantum mechanics, and now we're trying to make a theory that can explain both. But I mean, Occam's razor does say you should be able to if you could.
Ideally, but
Yeah,
I don't know enough about quantum theory to judge that. And I never like to talk about quantum theory, because when I speak to quantum theorists, they will disagree with each other anyway. So
I guess combining consciousness, psychedelics,
yeah,
and quantum theories, that's a bit too much.
yeah.
At that point, we are taking a little too far. Well, personally, I have taken psilocybin in the past. I think it was maybe about 6, 7 years ago. It's been a long time. Perhaps I'm overdue. But I remember having one horrible experience, but it's partly my sister's fault. She ruined the vibe. Let's just say she killed it for all of us. And then what we did was, I think 2 days later, because it was quite a traumatic experience, and then 2 days later, her husband, myself, I don't even know if I should be sharing this, but anyway, it's a bit too late.
You can always cut it out, can't you?
Yeah, but I might keep it in. We redid it just to, and we told her, look, you cannot join us for this one. we kept it out. We put it to the corner, just the naughty corner for a bit. And then the best experience. All of us just had the most wonderful time, life-changing. Some of us stopped. I mean, one person stopped smoking. One person. I mean, it was quite a therapeutic environment. We set it up in a way where we all had these goals, this New Year's resolution. It was pretty cool. So these effects I felt, first-person phenomenological experiences, and I do get what you're talking about. But I'm curious to know, how do you define psychedelics? Because I often think when we try and define this, it's also quite difficult, because anything could be psychoactive in a sense. If you take caffeine, if you eat a really intense meal that's got a high dose of sugar, at what point do we differentiate between normal psychoactive substances and an absolutely psychoactive substance like psilocybin or DMT, etc.?
Well, again, there's no sharp edges here, and there's a big debate about it, actually. So the sort of easy answer would be to limit the term psychedelic to those drugs that act on the what are they, 5-2-HA receptors, the serotonin receptors. So that would be LSD, psilocybin, the classics, what are generally known as classic psychedelics. So that would be like a relatively clear-cut way of defining them. However, that would exclude salvia divinorum, for example, which has very similar effects to LSD, acts on GABA receptors, I think it said. Also, when you read this 1957 paper by Osmond, where he actually coins it, before that, he was in correspondence with Huxley about what to call these new agents. Um, he sort of includes nitrous oxide because of William James's work. And he defines it mostly phenomenologically rather than physiologically. And I prefer this, generally speaking. So you would include nitrous oxide, and thus you would also include ketamine. In fact, only working at Exeter did I realize that ketamine at high doses can be very visual and sort of psilocybin-like. But do you include, like MDMA, for example, ecstasy? Do you include cannabis? Um, yeah, that's where the edges get blurred. But I personally generally am quite open in my definition, and then you get like psychedelic as an adjective, like so you can say maybe breathwork induces psychedelic experiences, right? So breathwork itself, of course, is endogenous, but the effects, the phenomenology is somewhat similar. So my only definition is I would not restrict it to serotonin receptors, drugs that act directly on serotonin receptors. I would keep it more open than that and base it more on phenomenology. So what phenomenology? Well, altered states of consciousness. But there are many such states. So I'm thinking LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, they induce can induce quite often beautiful visions. But if you take 5-MeO DMT, which I mentioned, that is just not beautiful visions at all. It's just, white light, generally speaking, white light, and then the loss of everything, loss of sight, hearing, memory, thought pattern, sense of time, it's all lost, but there's a profound experience or state of being that remains, and that's known as a psychedelic. I mean, it coincides with the word mystical. If you try to define that, there's so many different definitions of that in the early 20th and mid 20th century. William James, defined it in certain ways. Pint, passive, ineffable, noetic, and transient. But then other people defined it in different ways. I mean, what in trials today, a number of questionnaires are used to determine the experiences people had on psychedelics. And a lot of those questionnaires, especially the MEQ, Mystical Experience Questionnaires, based on a philosophy book by Walter Stace from 1960 on mysticism and philosophy. And he defines mysticism in a certain way there, but it differs from others, So it's, no. I don't think you can define these things that well, generally. I think, what's important ultimately is, how we use those definitions. There's also another interesting aspect to this, which is that because of the kind of Christian heritage and also Platonic or Neoplatonic heritage we have in the West, there was a way of interpreting psychedelic experiences as particularly mystical or theological in a way. Whereas when you look at psychedelic use in, let's say, Peru, very different, it's not about becoming one with the universe or connecting or losing the sense of space, never mentioned these things. And so you have to sort of wonder whether people are being primed into expecting these experiences because of the history of the field, or whether they're having those experiences because of their general Western cultural context. Or whether they're having many experiences, but they're only being asked to report on certain experiences. A paper came out, a preprint, last month that I co-authored, our secondary author, not the main author, but the suggestion to rename psychedelics into psychosomedelics, including the body, because there's a lot of bodily feelings that are very often ignored in these trials and whatever, right? So there's so much cultural baggage that comes into the science. It's quite alarming, actually.
It can't escape the psychology and philosophy. I find both of them equally fascinating in different ways. Well, not equally, but both fascinating in different ways. But the ontological aspect of this, the metaphysics behind it, it's such a fascinating field. It's so difficult to not get absorbed and high on this feeling of discussing it. But
I always say that psychedelics are a gateway drug to metaphysics. Ultimately, that's what's going on.
Yeah, it's impossible to not discuss it. But something I find fascinating is, I mean, one could say that, okay, let's say you use psilocybin, you start to notice that the earth is sort of breathing, you start to see the earth as an organism, and then you sort of realize that this entire planet is alive. Is that because that is the essence? I mean, you briefly touched on the comforting delusion, but I mean, that could be the one aspect, but the other could be the plant has just developed this gene that allows it to trick us to enjoy these wonderful occasions and thereafter and nurture itself because we'll obviously plant this and keep it going. So they might it might just have nothing to do with it. But
I mean, there are obviously delusions going on. You know, if you see a pink elephant walk across the table, you know, it's probably not any. It's very little truth value to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the question. I mean, that's the interesting question, which is metaphysical and epistemic. And you know, do these drugs allow you to see some form of reality? You know, and you can't. I mean, with the comforting delusion objection, I mean, there's a metaphysical assumption of materialism there, right? Well, we know what reality is, and therefore, if you experience like an idealism, which is quite common, for example, or pantheism, or some kind of monism or whatever, you know, unity of experience, and that obviously is false. So therefore, one shouldn't treat people with it. Well, okay, yeah, if you've established the fact that that materialism is true, but that's the question, right? And some studies from Imperial, from Chris Timmerman, people like that. Well, Chris Timmerman's study a few years ago showed that generally when people take psychedelics, they do shift their metaphysical positions, generally away from physicalism to kind of panpsychism. But the problems with those studies, like it didn't include idealism, for example, pantheism within it, and the way they define panpsychism is kind of loose. But nonetheless, there are metaphysical shifts. I mean, the classic cases in philosophy is A.J. Ayer's experience. You know, I don't know if you ever read about that, but he choked on salmon and had a psychedelic experience, and wrote an article saying that he now believes that consciousness might survive death after all, but there's still no God. You know? So, yeah, like you say, these experiences can be life-changing. But are they true? How do you determine truth? This is the classic question. I think that what the hard problem of consciousness does is that it leaves options open. And when you really understand that, you realize you can't easily just dismiss idealism or absolute monism or whatever. And they are, I think, open questions. There's a lot of logic behind all of them, a lot of criticisms behind all of them. But anyway, the point is that they are open questions. And when you have a psychedelic experience, it is thus possible that you are having, in certain cases, vertical experiences, you know, on the sort of deeper cases where you have those kind of like classic mystical experiences. I think those mystical experiences, some evidence shows that they are actually conducive to therapy as well. And then, yeah, so I don't think, though, that the experience itself can prove any metaphysical experience, right? For that, you still need philosophy and science, and you know, you need both of them there, right? Yeah, I don't think you just dismiss them out of hand because, you know, delusion is, you know, like completely dependent on what you understand reality to be. So maybe there's some kind of truths. Like, for example, I was mentioning Whitehead's theory of prehension, which is like the absorption of feeling from the outside into the inside, you know, using spatial metaphors. So often with psychedelics, you know, you look at a plant and you sort of feel it, you know, you think you feel it. And this could be one of the reasons why people do kind of get more sympathetic to panpsychism to a certain extent. And under sort of Whiteheadian framework, you can kind of begin to understand it a little bit more. You know, you are becoming a little bit more conscious of that prehensive activity that generally happens, or you're a bit more open to it, or your mind kind of fixates on it to a certain extent. That doesn't prove it's true, of course, but it does make more sense of it. So I'm open. Like I say, I'm quite open-minded to these things being possibly veridical, but at the same time, I do realize that some of them are mutually exclusive. You know, so like you might have an absolute idealist experience one day, and the next day you have dualist experience. You know.
Yeah, but it seems to me that these psychedelic drugs seem to move towards more of a non-dual experience. For the most part, it does feel like you become more at one with everything else. And Peter, from your side, what's been, from your first person experience in your research, what's been the most intense experience, and what was the substance?
Well, there's only one contender for that, which is the 5-MeO-DMT that I tried once in a legal setting, I should say. And just 5-MeO-DMT is not DMT, not normal DMT, which people speak about. It's radically different in its effects. You can get it from the secretions of the Sonoran desert toad and also in some vines and synthetic versions of it. What happened to me was quite extreme. There's a guy I know who does it every single Sunday for the last sort of 4 or 5 years, right? Without fail, which I can't really understand. I tried it once and I actually don't dare to take it again at the moment. Anyway, that was about 2 years ago. What happened? Well, what happened to me is I tried a small bit with a vaporizer and didn't work, and I thought I measured it out properly. I had this friend of mine sort of supervising, very importantly, and said, okay, let's increase the dose. Nothing happened. Third time, nothing happened. I thought, okay, I'm one of these like small percentage of people just doesn't get an effect from it. I said, just give me the rest, then I'll just try that. That was a mistake. So I don't know how much it took, but it was what happened then is you breathe it in, you hold it, and then suddenly what happened to me at least was suddenly everything goes white, so you sort of become blind. A few hexagons maybe, a bit like your shirt kind of appear on my shirt. Just very mildly, but mostly it's white light, a whiteout it's called, you see. Quite common. Although a friend of mine actually said he had a blackout, not a blackout, black vision as it were. And then very quickly you lose your sensibility, so you lose your hearing, you smell, your sight, as I say. And at this point, personally, I thought, oh shit, I'm dying. I've taken too much. This is very bad. I've never had this experience before in the space of a few seconds. And then suddenly my thought, again within the space of a few seconds, my thought process was like, oh no, is this death? I don't even know. That's a horrible way to die, isn't it? When you're not even sure. And then boom, everything's gone. The sense of time disappears. Your memory disappears. Your sense of self disappears. But what remained, and it lasts about 10 minutes in Earth time. What remained is like this extreme sense of profundity. It was like it was an sort of a state. It was so extreme. I can hardly call it consciousness or experience. I call it a state of existence almost. But it was just this sense of extreme importance or extreme profundity, but without an object. I don't know about what, because and interesting actually, in terms of philosophy of mind, that you can have these, okay, let's call it experience. You can have experience without an object, right? Against Brentano's famous intentionality claim that all consciousness has to have an object, right? Or it has to be about something. This didn't seem to be about anything at all, right? So that means you can have so that can't be a sort of essential demarcation of consciousness. That's another way in which psychedelics can sort of facilitate philosophy of mind. I should write one day an essay about that. I haven't yet. Anyway, so yeah, that was, and then slowly, about 10 minutes later, I kind of opened my eyes, slowly came out of it. Luckily, my friend was there saying everything's fine, everything, which was a lifesaver. If you did that alone, you'd have a panic attack. It's like a war zone, it's like extreme trauma in many ways. I don't recommend it to anyone really. I just did it for purely academic reasons because it's known as a God molecule. It's known as that which induces the unitive state more than anything else. I wanted to experience this myself, and I did write about it, in that book. But yeah, no, that was my most extreme state. I do prefer those psilocybin generally because of the beautiful aesthetics and feelings that you can get from that. Although, as you say, it can be. It's both the beautiful and the sublime, the terror sublime that Burke talks about. And that's actually another aspect of philosophy you can bring into like psychedelics, right? The whole, the aesthetic theory. In fact, I've got hopefully if she gets funding, a PhD student starting soon who's going to look at DMT aesthetics in relation to the sublime. Yeah, so
there's so many different branches this could take. But
yeah.
you mentioned that the self-criticism within the field is starting to grow.
Mm.
Why do you think this is? Is it just purely because some people are taking it too far, as with any field, or is there some sort of plateau happening? Do you feel like this renaissance might reach a plateau, or will it continue to thrive and mushroom, as you said?
Yeah. I hope it continues in some form and it's not outlawed. But the reason for the kickback, as it were, the imminent, not implosion, but self-critique is for a number of reasons. One is a lot of people didn't like the medicalization of psychedelics.
Mm.
So, like the people who were talking about psychedelics in the 90s and the early 21st century were, like former hippies or artists, and so on. And they didn't take it for healing, for therapy. They took it because it was interesting, artistically or intellectually interesting, and they had their little communities. And then it seems like there was a takeover by the medical community and pharmaceutical companies, and then obviously you see there's a lot of kind of Californian startup companies came in, and a lot of retreat centers opened, and it just became kind of very commercialized as well. And then so that was one reason for a lot of criticism. My colleague Christine Hauskeller, she talks about medicalization in critical theory terms, anti-capitalist terms, for example. Another reason was that there were promises made. There was like overhype to start with. Like I said, you had to get away from the kind of negative connotations that it had, but it kind of pushed it too far in the other direction. And then a lot of those promises never really happened, like would be using MDMA in 2018 to treat PTSD or whatever, and it just didn't emerge. It did, it's, in other countries, Australia. But there's kind of a little bit of disappointment. Like I said, a few bad apples. The Me Too movement got a few people down. But it's kind of inevitable. I think, with any new sort of like flourishing new movement, it sort of lots of people join in, and then a lot of them become disappointed, and then the criticism comes in, and then there's also the whole thing about cultural appropriation, of course, which is an interesting one because not all psychedelics are from indigenous communities. LSD was synthesized in Switzerland, for example. Nitrous oxide here, MDMA, so again, complex ethical issues and so on and so forth. But yeah, no, well, one navigates through. It's like you can't expect not to have any problems whatsoever. I mean, the biggest problem, of course, is the legal problem. It's still illegal. Most of these drugs. So to get funding for it, and even funding for trials, very expensive and a lot of hurdles to go through. But that kind of makes it more fun, more of a challenge.
Yeah, I fully agree with the overhyping because those who love it do tend to hype this up quite a bit to a point where it becomes too promising. But then when you look at the data, you can see, I mean, this is very promising stuff. In some of the fields, I know I read a few papers on psilocybin and the impacts they've had on depression rates, anxiety, etc. There's still a lot of work to be done, of course, but the more work you see coming out, the more you can see the potential, at least, which should allow for some sort of curiosity. And whether it's philosophical, ontological, there's definitely some sort of a practical significance that needs to be explored here. And yeah, to just completely shut it down would be pretty disappointing.
No, yeah. And also, I should just say, we're going through the medical therapeutic stage now, but I see, in the future, there's a Center for Minds with Bruce Damer, the NASA scientist that's just emerged, and they're funding their kind of foundation to help fund psychedelic research into creativity and innovation. So I see that as the next step now. So we're moving away a little bit from therapy, keeping that, but it's not just for the sick; it's for everyone, really. It's just inherently fascinating, as I say.
Yeah, it has become quite cold because I think in the one study I read, it has a psychiatrist, psychologist, patients laying on a bed and puts on a blindfold and then has the trip. I mean, that's not the most comfortable place. It's not the
Oh,
most calming environment as much as we'd love to believe it is. As a doctor,
yeah.
I know what their intention is, but
Mm.
really isn't the best place.
Well, that's what I mean by like taking incremental, careful steps. That's what's been happening. But at the same time, the old 60s motto was set and setting is so important. I
Yeah.
mean, again, it's another consciousness question about um, how your environment affects your mind and your general moods and whatnot. In fact, that's another very interesting aspect of psychedelic research. This old, what was once a debate within theology or mysticism studies between perennialism and contextualism. That so some people argue the perennialists like Huxley and maybe James and argue that although every culture interprets the peak mystical experience differently, the actual experience is the same, qualitatively identical, maybe numerically identical. Whereas the contextualists with Stephen Katz in the 70s said, no, actually, your culture completely determines the consciousness that you have, totally. And then there's a third way, of course, but this is psychedelic research has brought back this interesting debate, and it's a fundamental consciousness question, really. Like to what extent your
Mm.
surroundings and your mindset actually influence your consciousness, relating to again, 4E cognition and whatnot.
It-
So yeah, when you're having people in a little clinical room with an eye mask on and two people over watching them, it's a very particular setting, that might
yeah.
have
On
very
the bright
particular.
side, they've taken off the white coats, so it's the least they could do. Tell me, Peter, at this point in your life and your career, what part about all this work excites you the most? And what, let's say in the next 10 years, what are you most looking forward to within the philosophy of mind and psychedelics?
Um, I mean, I I think what at the moment, so this year, I spent the last few years looking downwards, as it were, into panpsychism. How far down can consciousness go? But I'm beginning to look upwards now. So I am interested. I'm going back to Hegel and the idealist, the absolute idealist, Bradley, as I keep mentioning. And I'm interested in this absolute, this
Mm.
related to psychedelics. As you were saying, there's a tendency towards this kind of absolute monism, and Spinoza in relation to that. So I'm beginning to and classic notions of pantheism or modern term cosmopsychism that interest me, like basically top-down approaches to consciousness.
Mm.
Ex I'm developing what I call exogenous mind theory. So that's like that we are partake of consciousness. So um, to a certain extent, seeing just basically having that hypothesis and seeing where it leads me. So both theoretically, but also interestingly empirically. So I think certain empirical tests can be made for this. Like I said, like testing brain activity in relation to certain of these psychedelic experiences would be very revealing. So that's where I'm heading at the moment. Um,
Have you called this exogenous mind theory? Have you formalized this as this what you're calling it?
yes, I've hereby formalized it.
That's great. I love that. I love when that happens.
Yeah, no, it's just
Why
notes at
did
the
you go
moment.
for that name?
I was when I was explaining Bergson in the masters or the PG cert and the PG cert that we teach here. So I was talking about how Huxley was drawing upon Bergson's theory of mind at large, and actually that's Huxley's term, mind at large and reducing valve from Bergson. And I just wanted to sort of get across this idea that generally today we have endogenous theories of mind, so the brain and body maybe sort of generate consciousness somehow. I think that's a default view pretty much. And that's a bottom-up approach, of course, right? Emergentism says it all. But Bergson has a top-down approach. So we we receive rather than generate consciousness. So the function of the brain is to restrict and channel outside data. So I thought, well, if you're going to call it in, like the general theories of self-induced consciousness, endogenous, so from within, and that includes panpsychism, much like microconstitutive panpsychism. That is also endogenous, coming from within up, as it were. what would you call the opposite? So it's going to be exogenous. Now, having said that, I'm not taking a Bergsonian view. So like I say, I think I think Matter and Memory from Bergson is one of the greatest books of philosophy ever written, but I think there's a fundamental logical flaw in his dualism. I think a monism's just more parsimonious. So an exogenous mind theory, which is kind of monism, but is related to absolute idealism and organic realism. Coming back to where I started now, yeah. So that's what I want to develop.
Would your
Um,
would your
yeah,
development of this theory be more empirical based or phenomenologically based?
I think actually more theoretically based. So at this point, I just want to modernize a number of the lost philosophers of the absolute idealists and new realists, and sort of integrate a bit from other philosophers, Bergson, especially maybe James. But at university, I'm in the psychology department, and not the philosophy department now. And there are many neuroscientists and psychologists I would love to work with, with regard to this. And there's a lot of, people who are very interested in funding this kind of stuff as well.
Mm.
So I want to develop this theory, but I don't want it to be purely philosophical. I want it to be, amenable to testing. If it's possible to be amenable to testing, that would make a very interesting essay in itself, because generally, as the problem with empirically testing theories of mind is the alleged privacy of the mind, right? If mind is private, then it's not empirical, right? By that definition, if you accept that differentiator of consciousness, which you might not. So how can we get around that if we need to? So these kind of, so systematizing all these theoretical questions and then fundamentally changing the way people think, normalizing what are considered strange theories of consciousness. I think this is my goal. And actually, another thing I'm involved with is this Mind at Large project with some Americans like Matthew Siegel, Andrew Davis, Andrew Schwartz, and others, Alex Gomez-Marin. And we're creating this 3-year project where we're having conferences around the world, maybe starting in Exeter in winter, and we're going to look at the history of consciousness, like why we are where we are, and then we're going to introduce, sort of the rationale, the logic of these other purportedly radical theories, and sort of and bring in a number of people from many disciplines, and so that's another big project I'm working on at the moment.
If you set a date on that, please let me know.
Well, I think the first one will be December 2025, and it's probably going to be at University of Exeter. We're just finalizing actually dates and times, but I'll let you know. Yeah, in fact,
send me an email. I'll love to come. I'll be there.
We're also looking for documentary filmmakers. We've got a number in mind. So it would be like not just conferences. Everyone says that conferences all the time. It kind of gets. But it'll be conferences, workshops. It'll be open to the public and private. And then we'll also have proceedings, but also documentary, hopefully.
And
that
sounds wonderful.
An exciting 3-year project.
Literally just having the similar conversation with Stuart about his Science of Consciousness conference. like, if you just invite me, I'll be there. Mind Body Solution will cover all of it. There was something specific I wanted to touch on before. What were you talking about prior to this?
Drugs, parties.
Well, yes. What's happening next? You said the exogenous theory. And then I wanted to ask you, Peter, what are your views on free will?
That old one. Yeah. So actually, mental causation is something I'm particularly interested in. And I see free will as a subset of that, because of course you get psychological determinism, which is mental causation, but it's not free. Schopenhauer's view, for example, right? So my my general take on free will is that I think it exists to an extent, right? So I think most of what we do is probably determined. Like most of you, when you walk, of course, you don't consciously make that decision to move your left foot and so on, right? Unless you're learning. So, and obviously, your language and your family upbringing and your schooling and your evolution, everything helps determine your DNA. It all helps determine how you act and whatnot. But why do people not believe in free will? Well, because it's not a known force of physics, right? It's not electromagnetism, gravity, or strong or weak nuclear force. Um, so the first thing I always say about that is, well, you know, we know they're not absolutely deterministic now with quantum theory, of course. And they're probabilistic, number one. Number two, with Whitehead and David Hume, for all we know, the laws of nature might fluctuate. The speed of light might change over 1 million years, so we can't really talk about these hard determined laws. We haven't got the right to talk about it because we cannot observe the future to test it. Hume's problem of induction, yeah. Number one, so I don't think the laws of nature are that strict or that fixed. And so that opens up the possibility of free will, right? But on the other side now, I love this argument from people like William James and Whitehead to a certain extent, but even Karl Popper, that what would be the purpose of consciousness if it had no power, if it had no causal efficacy? Like what would be its function? So in other words, why would it have evolved? Not only in human beings, but presumably amongst many organisms, right? Mentality, unless you think only mentality adheres to human beings. So the immediate retort to that is, well, it could be a spandrel, like the chin, for example. It evolved, but it doesn't play a purpose, just kind of side effect.
For folding
it's yeah. but of course, spandrels really pertain to one species, so but with consciousness you expect, you presume it's in many species, and it's not vestigial, it's maintained. Not only has it evolved, it's maintained itself. So, and of course, most people, when you talk about like, well, why did consciousness evolve, they'll say, oh yeah, so we could sort of differentiate berries from the leaves or something like that, or we like when we're thirsty, it's our body's way of telling us to drink, or our intelligence has caused us to create civilization and technology and whatever, right? Most scientists would accept this, that consciousness, there is mental causation, it plays a role. So there's good evolutionary reasons for mental causation. So I'm generally in favor of it. But I mean, another aspect of it, of course, is, have you ever read, I mean, one of the greatest philosophers I think of the last few years is Jae-Gwon Kim. He's got, he presents the exclusion problem really well. The problem with emergentism in relation to mental causation. When I say mental causation, though, I really mean, as a panpsychist, I mean psychophysical to psychophysical causation. Because if you're a monist or a panpsychist, which is essentially the same thing, I think, then there's not like a mental to mental and mental to physical causation, right? If the mental and the physical, if we're not dualists, we're monists, then there's only that lateral causation. That makes the most sense to me. Yeah. So essentially, I do believe in a limited free will.
Okay. Has anyone ever asked you if you have a solution to the combination problem? How do you address it?
Yeah. So the combination problem really is a problem for a panpsychism that has emerged in the last few decades with Galen Strauss and Philip Goff and people like that. But if you take a pan-experientialist type of panpsychism, you realize that combination is at the very heart of reality, right? The fundamental entities for Whitehead are actual entities, also known as actual occasions, or events, and they are prehensive, like I mentioned. So, in other words, the immediate past flows into and becomes the immediate present. So they're drops of experience, but they are constituted by the outside. This is a kind of extended mind theory, right? Not only the immediate past, but the immediate surroundings as well. So at the very fundamental base, as it were, of reality, you get combination, right? That's what prehension is. It's combination. And so the combination problem doesn't arise because that is the sort of axiomatic basis of that metaphysics. The reason for it is partly for logical reasons, so that you can't really, if you didn't presume that, then you would, as it were, break up reality into units which kind of succeed each other. This Whitehead calls the fallacy of simple location. And so he says, like when we think of an entity like an atom, we think of it, we conceptualize it as a single entity, but really it's completely related to its outside environment. Genes, likewise. In fact, that hypothesis led to the development of epigenetics via Waddington. That a gene expression of genes is related to its surroundings. And the same applies to instants and time. An instant of time is an abstraction, is a conception, really, and like flow, and the past, as it were, flows into and constitutes the present. So, in other words, it's a kind of logical way of understanding time and causation and perception, or as prehension, which therefore means that fundamental reality is relational. That's why it's called process relational philosophy. And another word for relational is combinatorial. That combinations are the very essence of things. Because without that, if you didn't believe that, you would think everything's isolated in nature, and somehow there's some kind of third relations that relate everything together. So instead of sort of interweaving processes, you get this kind of discrete atomic universe. So there's the deep if you think about reality on this deep metaphysical level, then that gets rid of the combination problem. If you're a Whiteheadian panpsychist, also known as pan-experientialist, he didn't come up with that term, by the way. Griffin did, but it works well. He's defined as panpsychist as well.
And at this point, cosmopsychist. Well, it's what you slowly trying to.
I'm going up there. Yeah, I'm beginning.
Getting higher and higher.
Yeah, exactly. How high can you go? Yeah, let's just go all the way. No, I'm not saying I believe it. Like I say, I entertain ideas rather than believe them. But I think it's a very interesting idea that there's, at the moment with panpsychism, there's just the external world is conscious, but it's like units, as it were, of consciousness that do combine. But how about if there's some more unified consciousness out there? That's an interesting question, and it's not completely implausible. I think the only danger is you go into, religion.
Yeah.
You call it God, but you call it cosmopsychism. It sounds quite formal. And,
most idealist theories eventually go down to that route.
Yeah,
at some point, it tends to hit that sweet spot. Some people call it love. Some people call it the one. Some people call it God. But it tends to get to that point. I realize I derailed us a bit, but you mentioned exogenous mind theory, and then you also mentioned mind at large, this conference, which hopefully I'll attend. But
you're most welcome.
What in conclusion, this conversation's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. There's so much work that you're doing, so much overlap between philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychedelics. What else in terms of the next few years are you looking forward to, except for those two aspects we just discussed? Any concluding thoughts? Anything you wish that you'd like to say as a concluding remark? Take as much time as you want, actually.
I mean, you mean academically or generally?
Academically.
Academically. I mean, I'm always interested in history as well, and I always think that history can inform philosophy. This is actually the British idealists were really into history. To fully understand something, you have to really contextualize it. So I always am aiming to increase my historical knowledge. That's one thing I'm pursuing. I'm looking at plasma physics now. Seems quite interesting. Something else I'm slowly getting into. Actually, another very important new direction I'm going is the relationship between metaphysics and politics. I think is very fascinating. It's related to why we believe what we believe now, but just the way, for example, Marx turned away from Hegel's dialectical idealism, saying that it was a bourgeois thing, and the way that like we moved away from idealism because of the war, partly. There's this great book I read on it actually by John Meerhead, I think it's pronounced, German Philosophy in Relation to the War from 1918, First World War. Just quite fascinating. So I'm looking at that relationship getting a bit more political. You know, I have to be dangerous again. Politics and religion now. Like, I shouldn't speak about that really, but
Mhm.
but that's my trajectory,
It's
I
just
think.
you're just a trailblazer. You go against the status quo. I love it. I think it's one of the best ways. Without people like you doing that, nobody's going to do it, and the work will not get done.
Right. Yeah. No.
Somebody's got to
Well,
do it.
exactly. Yeah. It's my hard life. No. No. Like I say, I can't complain. It's you know, I always aim to get a job, be getting paid to do philosophy in psychedelics, and that happened. So I'm happy.
Mm.
Well, my first aim actually was to be a rock star. It didn't work out. So plan B
Look,
worked.
there's still time. At the conference, you can always show them your skills.
I don't have any skills. That was the problem, you see.
I see. Okay, so that's a bit problematic. Listen, Peter, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I appreciate it. All the work you're doing, and this was really cool, man. Thanks.
Thanks for your questions. Great time. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and I hope we can have some chats regarding your exogenous theory of mind at some point, and let's see where this goes and dissect it further in the future.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, I have got a draft Word file where I'm sort of just yeah. When people ask me like you know, what do you really believe? Then I thought, okay, I'll just need to formalize it a bit. So
Yeah,
that'll be my book after this Metaphysics Psychedelics one, I think. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it very much. Thank you
Yeah.
once again. Any final words, Peter? Anything you feel like you want to clarify, or you should have said, didn't say, said, and want to correct?
I feel like I haven't spoken about Spinoza enough,
Okay.
because I do admire his work almost more than anyone else. But
I
we'll
was
leave
about
that.
to ask you who would you put on the top of that list instead of saving them from falling on from that cliff. Who is your favorite? But
Well, Spinoza.
yeah,
I think I focus on a few philosophers. So Spinoza, Whitehead, Nietzsche more in the past now. Schopenhauer. I'm getting in more and more into Bradley. F.H. Bradley, a lost philosopher, fantastic. I mean, his chapter against solipsism in Appearance and Reality is. I gave it to Christoph Koch in Philadelphia a few months ago because he said, you know, solipsism is just something that you have to assume. You know, you can't question it, but you can move on. You know, it's actually no, you can question it. It's like it's not at all a logical necessity, right? And Bradley's the best critic of that. So getting back into his work. Bergson intrigues me as well. So although I'm not a dualist.
mm.
Maybe he's not a dualist. There's just so much you can take from Bergson, just really fascinating insights, and it's a completely different way of thinking. You know, that's what Bergson offers.
And let's get back to
Yeah.
Spinoza. What about him has changed your life and the way you perceive this entire field?
I think just I just love the way he writes. You know, this geometric method, axioms, propositions, you know, corollaries and stuff like that. Number one, number two. Essentially, what Spinoza offers is a very simple thing. You know, a simple monism that there's one substance as opposed to Descartes' two. But mind and matter, Descartes' two, are just expressions or attributes of that one substance that creates then panpsychism. That one substance he calls nature. At the same time, he calls it God. So that's the pantheism. And just beautifully parsimonious, you know. Like I say, the only thing I don't like about it is it's not transitory, it's not developmental. And that was Hegel's critique of it. So in a way, like Hegel took Spinoza's philosophy and sort of just got it rolling, you know. Nietzsche said, without Hegel, there would be no Darwin, you know. But I think Hegel went a bit astray. Um, I'm also, I should say, rereading Hegel. I had the most amazing teacher of Hegel in Warwick University, Stephen Holgate. He's like what a leading scholar, you know, just such an inspiration. We called him Hegel by accident quite often, Holgate, because he still is. I mean, um, just so adamant about the correctness of Hegel and so inspiring. So I'm going back to Hegel now, but partly that's only to understand where we are now. Hegel's very difficult to get into, but I think quite rewarding for, you know, ultimately. I'm also looking at the other Jena idealists like Fichte and Schelling. I'm going back to the beginning. I did my master's dissertation on intellectual intuition in Kant's first critique and Schelling's system of transcendental idealism. So I'm sort of, it was like 20 years ago, so I'm sort of spinning back on that somehow. I still think there's like a lot of insights there that are just lost, right?
Yeah.
And there's just so much you can take. There's a treasure trove. There's like that part of German history, like in the late 1700s, early 1800s, just quite amazing, really, when you look back. Yeah, so. But also, yeah, I'm really it's really fun speaking to like psychedelic neuroscientists and scientists, because they're very open-minded to metaphysics. That's a surprising thing. They're not hardcore materialists as you might expect. They're Chris Timmerman, for example, who I'm going to London to speak with him on mysticism publicly at UCL in a couple of weeks. He told me to read The Blind Spot, by Evan Thompson,
Yeah.
two others, right? He's an activist, I believe.
Evan
He
Thompson,
was last time I spoke to him. So
yeah,
yeah, right. So anyway, like the great thing is really is that it's just the fact of the matter is scientists, of course, haven't got time to read philosophy. They don't know about it, and just like I don't know about quantum theory. So it's just nice to sort of have these conversations, and that people are very open to it, generally speaking.
Yeah, I've noticed that even with this podcast, it's really cool to see the diversity of thought around these topics and the openness to now learn more about the different fields, because it seems like everybody is starting to take this a little bit more seriously in terms of a philosophical framing of all these problems. And there seems to be almost a resurgence of not only just psychedelic research, but philosophy in general is becoming a bit more appreciated over time. And that's why this is a philosophy podcast. Yes.
Yeah, and metaphysics as well. We're going through the metaphysical turn. I think people are just like returning to it. It's like, oh shit, we've got this whole history. We don't have to turn to the East or whatever, although the East is quite fascinating in itself. But yeah, no, you're doing a good job. I mean, I'm a big fan of this podcast, as I said to you a year after responding to your email. So
yeah,
it's really interesting. When I drive to Exeter, I generally listen to this podcast.
Oh man, that's so heartwarming, and it means a lot to me. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Yeah, no, and now it's a pleasure for me to host you, and at least this time you can. Maybe one day you'll listen to your own episode, a bit of Peterception. Peter, thank you. This has been awesome, and I look forward to watching your journey, and hopefully you continue to enjoy the podcast on your drives to Exeter.
I'm sure I will, and I look forward to seeing you next to then.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been to the UK, so
oh really?
Time.
Okay.
Been everywhere else, I think, except maybe South America and the UK. So I think
not God's country. Right. Okay. Well,
if you're ever in Cape Town, South Africa, you can come visit me.
Yeah, actually, I've got a good friend from Cape Town, so I do mean to go there one day.
When you do,
I'll knock on your door. Yeah.
We'll try and host a consciousness conference in Cape Town.
Cool.
Cheers, Peter. Thanks so much.